DD-537 was originally going to have a relatively regular life. Laid down as one of the earlier Fletcher class about a quarter of the way into the main production run in October 1942, she was to be named USS Putnam, the second ship in the US Navy to bear the name. But about a month after her keel laying, the cruiser USS Juno was torpedoed and sunk off Guadalcanal, and among those lost in action were the 5 Sullivan brothers, at which point she was renamed USS Sullivan, and then again to USS The Sullivans, this time to make it clear that it was in commemoration of all of them and not any one particular brother. She was therefore launched under this new name 6 months after keel laying in April 1943, and then commissioned about 5 months after that in September. By the time she entered service, the scale of the aerial threat was quite evident, and the relatively light, dedicated anti-aircraft armament of the original Fletcher design had been upgraded several times, first by ditching the 1.1-inch quad mountings in favour of twin 40mm Bofors, and then adding some 20mm Oerlikons, then gradually populating with more Bofors and occasionally additional Oerlikons. The standard anti-aircraft setup by the point she commissioned was 10 40mm Bofors in 5 twin mounts and 7 single 20mm Oerlikons, although this did vary slightly per ship as some captains would request additional weapons, usually more 20mm, for installation where they could find space. This was of course in addition to the 5 single 5-inch 38 main guns, 2 quintuple torpedo launchers, and the depth charge throwers. Having conducted her shakedown cruise, the Sullivans reported for duty at Pearl Harbor at the end of 1943, where she took up her primary duty for the war, screening carrier task groups against Japanese air assault, seeing her first action during the invasion of Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands campaign. During this time, she would be one of 3 ships detailed to escort the carrier Intrepid back for repairs after she was hit by a night-flying Imperial Japanese torpedo bomber that managed to fly low enough to convince radar-equipped night fighters in pursuit that it had in fact flown into the sea. Until July 1944, she was normally attached to Task Group 58.2, seeing action in this role in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, before switching to shore bombardment duty for a bit, a role that she would bounce back and forth in until the end of summer, when she rejoined what was now Task Group 38.2 as an anti-aircraft screen ship again. In October, she was assigned to protect the damaged cruisers USS Canberra and USS Houston as they headed back to Ulithi, engaging in a running fight with multiple Japanese airstrikes that tried to finish them off, before rejoining the carrier forces in time to be assigned to the screen of the battleships of Task Force 34, which of course meant that she was part of the group that just missed out on confronting Center Force, which included the battleship Yamato, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. However, almost by way of compensation for that bit of bad luck, she managed to ride out Typhoon Cobra without any major damage. With the start of 1945, she was back with her friends in Task Group 38.2, which then became Task Group 58.2 once more as Halsey handed command back over to Sullivans, and the carriers hit targets in Formosa, now Taiwan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the Japanese home islands themselves. During the latter operations, she had an exciting time protecting a crippled sister ship, the USS Halsey Powell, after the latter was hit by a kamikaze and lost both steering and speed, with the Sullivans doing its best to alternately transfer crew and supplies during quieter periods, and then motor around at high speed spitting anti-aircraft shells at other kamikazes who saw the crippled destroyer and then tried to either finish her off or have a go at the Sullivans for daring to protect her. Shortly after that, she assisted the carrier USS Bunker Hill after her famous encounter with another kamikaze, and a few days later did her best to protect USS Enterprise from another mass kamikaze strike. This time one of them got through, which sent CV-6 home for the rest of the war. That would also be the end of the war for the Sullivans. Although not hit herself, she'd worn herself out significantly and would be in refit for the rest of 1945. After which she was decommissioned at the start of 1946 as the Navy demobilised. This decommissioning lasted for half a decade until she was brought back into service for the Korean War, where she briefly once again screened aircraft carriers, but with no North Korean Navy to really worry about, she was then reassigned to shore bombardment duty. But after just 3 months on station, she was reassigned to the 6th Fleet, based in the Mediterranean, and she'd alternate between this and anti-submarine operations off the US coast for the rest of the 1950s. During this period, she was refitted again, losing most of her 20mm and 40mm guns and one of her 5-inch, receiving a pair of 3-inch 50 caliber automatic anti-aircraft guns in exchange, as she'd already lost one of her torpedo launchers in the late 1940s. And then, in the early 1960s, she was swapped over to training duties as well as supporting the early Mercury space program, at some point in this period receiving a pair of triple Mark 32 anti-submarine torpedo tubes and losing the remaining quintuple anti-surface torpedo launcher. She would then be decommissioned one last time in 1965. 12 years later, in 1977, she and the cruiser USS Little Rock were donated to Buffalo in upstate New York as museum ships, which is where she remains to this day. In April 2022, a surge coming off the Great Lakes picked her up and then slammed her down on something solid on the riverbed, which caused a major hull breach and flooding, which in turn caused her to roll over on her starboard side. Luckily, the shallow depth of the berth meant that she settled without going completely under and was able to be salvaged in relatively short order, with restoration work still ongoing and the ship partially reopened for visitors. The museum will be open for the 2025 season from the end of March, and you can see a link in the video description below for an interview with the museum curator, which was done just after she was salvaged back in 2022.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.